Welcome to the Create Your Story podcast, with conversations on creativity, self-leadership and personality to inspire and support your wholehearted life. I'm Terry Conlon, author, creative transition coach, teacher and personality type practitioner. Before we begin today's episode, I'd like to pay my respects to the Darawal people, the traditional custodians of the land where I'm recording this podcast, and extend that respect to the traditional owners of lands across Australia and to elders, past, present and emerging. You can find the episode show notes, your free copy of Chapter 1 of my book, Wholehearted Self-Leadership for Women in Transition, and lots more information at quietwriting.com. Now settle back and enjoy today's show. Welcome to episode 9 of the Create Your Story podcast. And it's the 13th of January as I record this, and suddenly we're nearly midway through January. We've had a lot of rain here in Sydney, so it's humid and the gardens are going wild. But I've been able to swim and enjoy the midsummer temperatures. I've also been reflecting on 2021 via Susanna Conway's Unravel Your Year 2022 workbook this week, and also reflecting further on my 2022 Word of the Year to be revealed soon. Plus, I've been planning and preparing for the Wholehearted Self-Leadership Book Club. We'll be focusing on Chapter 1 of Wholehearted and the companion workbook next week together, as well as preparing for the Writing Road Trip with Beth Cregan, which kicks off with a free challenge on the 31st of January. So there are lots of new and exciting things this year, and I hope you'll join me in one of these offerings. Check out the links in the show notes on Quiet Writing at quietwriting.com/podcast and find the link to this episode 9. I'm so thrilled to have my friend Valerie Lewis from Visualize and Bloom join us for the podcast today to chat about creating grief coaching and pro-aging. Valerie Lewis is a multi-passionate 60-plus pro-ager. Through grief coaching and personal growth facilitation, she supports and empowers those who are lost and confused with the direction they want to take following a significant life event that has impacted them and their sense of self. Her interests include being an intuitive reader, Reiki and crystals practitioner, and avid creative dabbler. Valerie and I met through a project of a mutual connection, Julia Barnacle. That project was called What If Life Were Meant to Be Easy? Sadly, Julia passed away early in 2021 as a result of metastatic breast cancer. We connect today remembering Julia and with gratitude to her for connecting us. And it's fitting that we remember Julia's message of living a creative, easeful and positive life, even in the face of or after incredibly difficult circumstances. And this is the focus of the conversation today. Valerie has been a coaching client in the Sacred Creative Collective group coaching program, and we share many similar experiences, including moving through deep grief, and also our passions, which include a love of creative expression in many forms, and intuitive practices such as tarot as important self-leadership tools. Today we speak about creativity and how we respond and learn to move through tragedy, loss, grief, and challenging transitions, including aging. We have fun in this conversation, but we also traverse some tragic and sensitive topics, so I wanted to let you know this upfront. We consider creativity and intuition as sources of healing and growth and how they support us in making life transition. Valerie's story is an incredibly inspiring one, especially around how she creates as a central focus and value, how she's become a grief coach supporting others, and is a passionate 60-plus pro-ager. So now let's head into the interview with the wonderfully inspiring, creative, and multi-passionate Valerie Lewis. Hello, Valerie, and welcome to the Create Your Story podcast. Thank you so much for your connection and for your support of Quiet Writing.
Thanks for having me, Terry. It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm so looking forward to chatting with you today. So we've connected in many ways around creativity, transition. grief coaching and more. So it's great to be able to share conversations on those topics today with others. Can you start us off by providing an overview about your background, how you got to be where you are, and the work that you do now?
Wow. Where do I start? Well, I'm originally from the north of England, South Yorkshire, and I moved to London in the late 80s following the loss of my only child, my daughter, through manslaughter and the resultant breakdown of my marriage to her mentally ill father. As you can imagine, that was quite a traumatic time. So I would say that was the main reason why I moved to London, basically to start a new life, because I thought, well, I've got nothing to lose. And before my daughter died, I had instigated starting a degree, because I left school with minimal qualifications. So it was almost like something that I needed to prove to myself. So I had embarked on the initial stages of the degree. And then after my daughter died, the tutor that I had at the time, he was very encouraging. He said, well, why don't you apply to one of the universities or polytechnics, as they were called, and study that way rather than doing it as I was going to do through the Open University. In those days, you received the manuals through post, and then you do your assignments and work and then send them off to the tutor to mark. So I applied and I was accepted at Middlesex Polytechnic and ended up moving down to London to do my 4-year degree. And in some ways that helped me. That was a tremendous help. It gave me something to focus on and channel my energies in. And it was whilst doing the degree, a friend brought me a book. I made friends with 3 women at university, and we're still friends to this day. And one of them brought me a book called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway. And you could say that started the journey of self-discovery, self-development, finding out more about who I was. Life continued. I got a job. One of my sisters had already moved down. My other 2 sisters moved down. And then they eventually ended up moving back with their families and to buy their own homes because it's cheaper in Sheffield. And I've remained in London, as has my younger sister. Through that time, I worked. And there was a point at which, I think it was in my mid-30s, I don't know if you want to call it a quarter-life crisis or something, because I worked with engineers as their admin officer. And I remember looking at them absorbed in their work. And when it was time to go home, I used to think, aren't they going home? They just seemed content to stay there in the office. And I just remember thinking, I don't want to do this. Thinking, well, where do I want to go? I did a postgraduate course, the Diploma in Management Studies, because I thought, I'm in an administrative field. Maybe that's the direction that I want to go in. And I remember thinking to myself, well, I don't want to trap myself. I don't want to just focus on this. And I think it was through reflecting on who I was, where did I want to go? I remember realizing that actually I needed to be creative because that was what fed me. And I'd kind of neglected that. I'd always been creative. I'd kind of neglected that because I was studying and basically adapting to life in London. And so I started getting back into being creative, making cards. Then I discovered salt dome modeling and got into that. And one of my other sisters, she's quite creative too. So we used to get together. And when her children were young, the schools would have craft fairs. So we'd book a stall and we'd have a table together. She'd make her own stuff and I'd make my stuff. And I thought, I enjoy this. I thought, I don't want to be trapped in a job where I'm working all these long hours. I want to have some time away from that where I can do some of the things that I want to do. That's basically how I've been throughout the past 30 years, if you like. Sometimes I felt a bit conflicted about it because you see your colleagues climbing at the ladder in whatever field they're in. And obviously earning more money. I did get a promotion. I went for a promotion and my pay jumped quite substantially. And I felt comfortable with that, because one of the things I realized after my daughter died, I remember thinking to myself, you could have all the money in the world, and in some ways it's kind of meaningless if people that you care for are not here anymore. So in some ways, I'm not materialistic in that sense. I like to have nice things. I like to wear nice things, and I like to be able to have my books around me and makeup and eat nice food. But having a lot of money is not my main goal. Feeling fulfilled is more important to me, more meaningful to me. Does that make sense, Terry?
It does, absolutely. So thanks for that snapshot of your life over many years and what's important to you. I think that what comes through strongly is your values and how you want to live your life. So we'll explore more about that as we go through our conversation today. So thank you for that. So we've both shared a major transition, in your case from corporate life to a more creatively focused life. So can you describe what that transition's been like for you and how long it took and the main turning points?
That happened last January. In some ways, I saw it coming because for the past few years at work, there've been lots of changes, the constant restructurings. My role, if you like, became less than what it used to be. It got less stressful. Certain aspects of it, the nicer bits, if you like, the more creative bits of it were taken away and given to another department. And I remember thinking, me and my colleagues thinking, this is strange. Something's going on in the background, and the restructure that they had before we were told our jobs were going to be moved up north. It happened with one of the teams. They were restructured, and I think a couple of people were made redundant, and the other team basically transferred up north. So that's why the two people were made redundant from that. And we thought, well, this is odd. If they've moved part of our department up north, what does that mean for us? So in some ways, it was almost like you think it's going to happen at some stage. And I actually welcomed it. So when it came, it wasn't a complete shock. I wasn't devastated because I thought, I'm approaching 60. I think it's time. It felt as if it was time for me to be doing something different, something more meaningful, something that I had more control over. So the only thing that I knew that I would mentally have to adjust to was the lack of consistent income. Because obviously when you're working, you've got an income coming in every month and you know how much is coming in. But if you're not getting that income, you've got to create it yourself. So I knew that would be a challenge, but I thought, well, I'm up for it. Yeah.
Excellent. So it sounds like you knew the transition was coming, so you had some time to mentally prepare and perhaps practically prepare for it. I think that helps too. Certainly for my own transition, it was quite similar. I could see the writing was on the wall. You could see things were coming. And for me, I started to make a plan for what my life might look like when that time came. So I think that helps as we move through and change. It's interesting you mentioned that you made that conscious decision in your 30s not to climb the corporate ladder. So you had space for creative interest. So how do you feel about that decision now? Was that a good decision?
It's hard to say. I mean, other people might, well, I don't think anybody else sort of really looks at it. It's more about me, isn't it? There are occasions when I think, maybe if I'd stayed in the job and become this, I might have been head of this. And then I think, no, this is the road I chose, so I'm happy with it. And in some ways, doing a lot of the things that I've done feeds into what I'm doing now.
So tell us about what you're doing now.
I certified as a coach. I've done jewelry making. So in some ways, I've had a taste of self-employment, even though I was employed, if that makes sense, and earning little bits of money, pockets of money. So it's not something that's totally alien to me. I think that I can use my creativity in my coaching and in other ways to help me achieve an income.
I often talk about Elizabeth Gilbert's line about the long runway, where we're preparing along the way, perhaps many years before, for what we end up wanting to do that's important to us. Does that relate to you?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think you realise it at the time, do you? Because I look at other people. I look at my sister, for example, who's an executive coach, and she climbed the career ladder. And when she was made redundant, when she started to think about what it was she could do, she realised that one of the things that she'd enjoyed whilst she was employed was coaching others. So she's taken that aspect and also did a master's in coaching psychology, and is using that and drawing from her skills in the corporate or in the civil service, if you like. So I think we do draw on our skills. I'm sure in what you're doing the same, aren't you?
Absolutely. And as you were talking, I was thinking of my own experiences and your sister's and your own, those threads that we value, that we go back to over time. And often as we're getting older, we start to stitch them together in different ways. And I think that's a really exciting part of our journey. Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So do you want to tell us about what your life looks and feels like now?
It's kind of like I'm more in charge of it. Self-leadership, that word that you introduced me to. I feel very much my own person. There's a sense of freedom, if that makes sense. I'm much more at peace with myself. I feel as if I'm more in tune with my own values, and I'm not going into work and having to do things that conflict a little bit with how I think or feel.
Wonderful. Yeah. So you really have put into practice the things that are important to you, that self-leadership, creativity, embracing who you are. So it's been a real joy to connect with you and to learn from you too, and share our experiences as we've moved along our road. So you mentioned earlier about the tragic death of your daughter and only child, and your wholehearted story that you wrote for Quiet Writing, The Silent Whispers of My Mind. You share your story and what happened, the impact upon you. Can you explain or share with us what you learned from moving through and on from such incredibly difficult circumstances?
At the time, I wasn't sure about what I'd learned. And I remember sort of thinking, am I strong? Am I coping with this? And it wasn't until I volunteered with, I don't know if you've heard of Great Ormond Street Hospital for Sick Children. I volunteered. They have a helpline, the Child Death Helpline. I think it might be called something different now. But I applied to volunteer for that as a bereaved parent. And it was offering emotional support to basically anybody who was impacted by the death of a child, whether they were the parent, the grandparent, the aunt, the teacher, whoever. Perhaps they were feeling upset or traumatized. It was a free helpline, so they could call the helpline and just pour out their feelings. And we were there, as a volunteer to listen. And it was through listening to their stories, it made me realize that I had come a long way and that I was actually quite resilient and emotionally strong. And I learned that, it's a bit cliche, that there are more questions than there are answers. And that sometimes we just have to accept that we can't know the answers to everything, as hard as it is, because that used to probably torment me in the early days. Why? And there were certain answers that satisfied me so much. And then I'd want to go beyond that and think, well, no one can tell me why. I know why she died. I know what was wrong with my ex-husband. I know those sort of medical reasons why. But in the bigger scheme of things, it's almost like, well, why was it her time? Why did she go then? And I don't think anybody can give me an answer to that. So I've had to learn to accept that's just how life is. We don't know when we're going to go. Sometimes we have signs like if you're ill, terminally ill, then you know, but you don't know necessarily why you became terminally ill, what led up to that. So there's lots of things that we don't know, or we will never know, and we can't know, and we just have to come to terms with that, or else we'd go mad. I think.
No,
Yeah.
thank you.
I've also learned how important it is to have a wall of support around you. It's so important, because I don't think I'm speaking out of turn here with the helpline when I say that there were people who didn't have that support and they were really struggling. They had no one to turn to apart from the helpline. And I think just knowing that there are people around you can help to make you feel emotionally supported. And sometimes in a practical sense as well.
Absolutely. I think the points you've raised are just so important, particularly that what we learn or the experiences we go through, grief is really a journey over time. That's certainly something I've experienced with the grief that I've experienced in my life. It's and I think you conveyed that beautifully in the silent whispers of my mind, just that horrible shock when something as terrible as that happens, and how we start to make our way through the early days and then over time. You talk about from fragmented to wholehearted. So thank you for sharing that. And I think the fact that you were able to volunteer to help others helped you realise how much you'd learned is a really powerful story too.
Thank you. And something else that I learned was that really there's only you can decide what your values are. Because I think sometimes when we go through difficult times, it does make us reflect on what's important to us or not. And really no one else can decide for you.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No,
Have you found that to be?
I have. My brother passed away tragically. So I went through a difficult time. And that's the time that I went back to my creativity, which is my number one value, similar to you. And I think the loss of someone so special and so loved in tragic circumstances particularly, it does. It just makes you go back to those places. And I think you look at your life in a different way. So in your work that you do now, you take those experiences to coach others, which is really beautiful that you're able to take the hard-won learning and experiences that you've had to be able to support others. So can you tell us about your coaching in this area and how you support people experiencing grief?
Right. Well, grief coaching, if you like, could be seen as a niche or a specialisation within life coaching. I think it's quite new. It's basically aimed at individuals who've experienced loss, whether it's a death or non-death related, and need support and guidance on their grief journey. As you know, coaching is about moving forward. With grief, you've got that additional aspect of somebody who may be still going through the various stages of grief. They may still be a little bit hurt, a bit angry, in disbelief. So grief coaching is also providing practical support using many of the same coaching tools common to life coaching, as well as providing emotional support through creation of a safe and supportive space for the client to feel that they can heal and grow and that they can express their feelings around grief without judgment. So there's a similar way, it is coaching. But what I found is that in terms of goal setting, they've got to be gentle goals, very small. They may have a big goal, but really with a lot of people who are going through grief, it's just creating small goals to help them get through the day. And I find that self-care comes into it quite a lot. So that's one of the areas that I have tended to focus on with people going through grief. What can they do to be compassionate with themselves, to love themselves, to nurture themselves? What little steps can they take and turn those into goals and actions? And until they feel strong enough to tackle the bigger goals.
Yeah, so that's a real form of that self-leadership we talked about before, is taking control or taking care of what you can in a very traumatic, often very traumatic situation.
Yeah.
And what's the pathway to grief coaching? Obviously, personal experience of grief is...
Yeah, personal experience. And I came across the Institute of Life Coaching Training. They're an American organization. I came across them a couple of years ago and thought about it and then put it from my head, like I do with a lot of things that are intuitive. And I kept getting pulled back to it, and in terms of thinking about what niche I wanted to focus on. Before that, I'd looked at working with women who were midlife and who were looking to reinvent themselves. But then I started to think, what can I do with my experience of grief or what I've been through? And this is where I discovered this course on the internet. And it kept coming back to me. And I think it was once I knew that I was going to be made redundant, I decided, right, I'm going to sign up for this course, because I just felt that I needed some structure. I needed some support around that. I mean, I thought I've been through my own experience, but I need this extra, how do you coach somebody? But as I said, we draw on very much the same sort of tools as we use in life coaching. It's just this other additional element of supporting somebody, being there and creating this safe space for them.
It's very important work. And I think for many of us, our life experiences, what happens to us, the skills we gain, the insight we gain is often what we channel into coaching, isn't it? It's often a challenging journey, but I think the wisdom that we gain from our experiences, the insight and the tools that we develop are so important to pass on to others. So it's great that you're doing the work in this area that will help so many people.
Thank you.
So creativity, obviously a very important part of your world. It's been a touchstone for you over time. And more recently, you shared in your piece, The Silent Whispers of My Mind, how intuitive abstract painting's been a big part of your journey. So how has creativity been a source of growth, expression and insight for you?
I would say I've been creative in some shape or form ever since I was a child. I think it's just a natural part of me. It's something I turn to, whether I'm happy or sad. It just helps me. I find that being creative, it's something I can lose myself in. Whether this taps into being an introvert, I don't know. But I like to sometimes go into my own little world, and shut out everything else that's going on around me. And I find that obviously you can do that when you're working on you're doing something creative. And I often find that in the act of being creative, and it's silent around you, or you might be a person who likes music playing, you can ruminate, you can think more clearly. And if something's bothering you, sometimes you find that the answers come to you.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I'm sure it can be the same for introverts and extroverts, but I think introverts definitely draw energy from that time alone and that creative space. So yeah, it sounds to me your personality type, which I know is introvert, INFP, you have a preference for introversion, intuition, feeling and perceiving. It would make sense that a tool like creativity, whether it's painting or jewelry or some of the things you've mentioned, provides a vehicle to create a quiet space where you can energize and make sense of things. So your intuition is also something you share a lot about in The Silent Whispers of My Mind. What I found fascinating in that piece is how you tracked through learning to listen to your inner voice over time. So can you share with us more about learning to listen to your intuition and how it's guided you? Because it's not often talked about, is it, intuition?
No, it's still something that I find hard to articulate because it's abstract, isn't it? You can't see it. And it is different for everybody. You look back on things and you think, well, what helped me? And then it's just being aware that there were certain times when I seemed to know what I was doing. I felt as if I was actually being guided. And I suppose some people might say, it's God. And I think, well, it could be God. And then over the years, having different experiences, and you think that's what they call your intuition, like a silent voice or a sense. It's like your body knows the right thing to do. Something's baffling you or confusing you, and you're weighing up pros and cons. And then out of the blue, when you're doing something totally different, an answer comes into your head, or you're doing something and you get a reaction in your body. And it's through experiencing that and then learning, when I experience that, that means I've got to listen to that. And just learning to be aware of those sensations. It's learning to be quiet and still and just being in the moment. And I think being creative helps you do that. I've heard people say that running, for example, does that for them. You know, going for a run clears the cobwebs away, and they're in that moment. And maybe if they've had a problem, they've been churning over in their heads, they gain clarity in that moment. So there's definitely something to be said about learning to be still, shutting out everything else around you, and really being in that moment. So for me, being creative is like a kind of mindful meditation. And I suppose in some way that's where the abstract art came in. That was kind of a mindful meditation. I don't know what I'm going to paint. I just have these paints in front of me and I start doing shapes and ideas come into my head. Oh, that represents so-and-so. That means so-and-so. But initially, I might not know what it is I want to get down on paper.
I think it's fascinating that abstract intuitive art was what you felt very drawn to. It's obviously something that called you over time. And when you describe your creativity, the power of it, intuition, it seems to bring all the pieces together. So it's perfect. I love that you describe yourself as a 60-plus Pro-Ager, Valerie. That's great. I love that term. What does that mean for you? Tell us a bit about that.
It was, how can I put it? I think for me, as I approached 60, I thought, my gosh, am I still middle-aged? And then I actually had to Google it to see what years middle-aged encaptured. And I thought, well, I'm at the tail end of age. And it was like looking at older relatives around me and thinking, there's a part of you that's a little bit fearful about getting older. And that term, to me, it helps me allay those fears about being over 60 and getting older. It's about me accepting that, yes, I am getting older. I can't hide that. And really, I don't want to. I think it's something to actually be proud of, because not everybody, you know, my daughter died at 7. She didn't make it to 61. My mum's mum, I think she died at 63. My mum's 84. So it's actually something to be really, really proud of. And regardless of what society says, I think we've got more freedom. We've been allowed the opportunity for more self-expression than our parents' generation, if you like. And I think we should take advantage of that to the full. We should create our own rules, dress how we want to dress. If you want to dye your hair, dye it. If you don't want to dye your hair, don't dye it. And live life as fully as you can within your capabilities. I look around me and there's people my age and a bit younger having hip replacements and dying from cancer and things like that. So I think to myself, life's short. I think you're just aware of your own, mortality when you reach this age. So you think to yourself, I'm not just going to sit here and sort of accept that I'm getting older. I want to live my life. And so being pro-age, it's about accepting that you're a certain age, but not letting that age define you or defeat you.
Beautiful. Yeah. And I was fascinated to hear that you did what I also did recently, which was look at middle age and the span, because I was asking the same questions only recently, because I just turned 60 not long ago. Yes, I was thinking, am I still middle-aged or am I old-aged now? What am I? And I did the same thing.
You're a Pro-Ager.
I'm a Pro-Ager, yeah. But I was fascinated to find there, like it's like middle-aged reaches that point, and then there didn't seem to be a term. so much for after. So I do like that Pro-Ager. I was listening to a podcast, the Magnificent Midlife podcast, and there was a guest on there who talked about being ageful, which is nice too. I love that, and I certainly agree with you about celebrating the wisdom of all that we've learned, the sharing of that with others, which in your journey is really important. So I love your attitude. It's fantastic.
This is where the modelling comes in.
Yes, I've seen on Instagram. Is that a new career for you?
I wouldn't say it's a career. It's a form of income, but it's another form of being creative, if you like. And it's also about, in a way, me celebrating being the age I am. Because if you look back 10, 15 years ago, who would have thought that somebody in their 60s would be doing modelling? But I think there's more of us reaching a certain age. And I think companies are appreciating that their customers want to see a greater representation of people who look like them. And so this is the right time for me to be doing this, because I am not what you would call sort of fashion model. I don't look like a fashion model. I'm not the right height. I'm not the right build for it. But I might look like somebody who you'd see in the street or your next door neighbour. So that's basically what I'm doing, lifestyle modelling. And it's quite fun. It's something different and it's fun. Yeah,
the pictures you shared on Instagram, I was just blown away. I found it so inspiring. It was fantastic to see. So, let's be interested to hear more about it as you get more into your modelling career. It's fascinating. So there's a couple of questions that I'm asking all the guests on this podcast, being the Create Your Story podcast. It's a big question, but it's really just seeing what comes to mind from the question. So how have you created your story over your lifetime?
That's an interesting one. It's almost like there hasn't been a rule book to follow. So in many ways, circumstances have shaped some of my story, and other aspects of my story I've taken charge and shaped myself. For example, not climbing a career ladder when that's something that society expects of you, if you like. I chose not to do that. Some of the creative things I'm doing, such as modelling. And what is interesting is meeting other people who are of the same age group who have decided to do that as well. And thinking, wow, this is fascinating. So my story has been shaped by, I suppose, obviously my parents and people of their generation, my upbringing, being a Black person in a mainly white society, that's helped to shape it, being a female. In two of my jobs, I worked in a more male-dominated environment, and also the circumstances I've been through have helped to shape my story. And also, I think I'm a little bit eccentric and I've got a strong streak of independence. There's always something in me that slightly wants to dance to my own tune. So that's helped to shape my story too. It's still continuing to shape my story.
Absolutely. No, that's great. It's lovely to hear all the different aspects that have shaped you, your personality, circumstances, and how you've responded to them. So, thank you for sharing that. So, wholehearted self-leadership is obviously part of creating your story and a key part, and I've shared some tips in my book, but I'm interested for people on the show to share their top wholehearted self-leadership tips and practices, especially for women. So what comes to mind for you as the top tips?
I think the main thing that I would say is work on being true to you. Who are you? Or who do you want to be? And that might mean a lot of self-reflecting, digging deep within yourself. I would say a good starting point is looking at your values. What are the things that make life meaningful to you or could make life meaningful to you? The values that you hold, are they yours or the values of others? What do you dislike about yourself or what do you dislike about other people? Ultimately, are you living your life for you or for others? And I think that sort of question becomes more important the older you get, especially as you reach middle age. Maybe if you've had a family, and your life has been focused on your family, I think you can lose yourself, whoever you were. So at some point, I think most of us, you start thinking about, who am I? What am I here for? What gives me joy? And that's where the self-reflecting comes in. And as I say, looking at your values, I think that's a good starting point. Because
Absolutely.
your values change over time, don't they? And you might be holding on to things that, are really not helping you anymore. It's dragging you down.
I think that's great. And I think that question about whether you're living a life for yourself or for others, and sometimes it's that overlay of, family values or cultural values or corporate values. It's almost like we have to clear them off sometimes just to work out what's important for us. I relate to that.
That's right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's like a clarifying process. So beautiful. I love that. And that idea of, working on being who you are, who you want to be, and what gives you joy, I think are beautiful tips for women to take to heart. So thank you so much for our conversation, Valerie, today. It's been so heartwarming, so inspiring, and a lot of fun. So thank you so much for sharing your story. Can you tell us where people can find out more about you and your work online?
Okay, my website, Instagram and Facebook under Visualize and Bloom, and LinkedIn under Valerie A. Lewis. And also people can sign up to receive my periodic newsletter. I say periodic because I'm not one of these that sends out a newsletter every month. It's more like once a quarter. So if they sign up for my newsletter on my website, I've just created a guided meditation. They can receive a free downloadable copy of it. It's basically called the Violet Cloud Guided Meditation for Difficult Times.
Perfect. That's a beautiful gift for people who connect with you. So we'll pop all those links in the show notes, and I'll also make sure the link to your Wholehearted story, The Silent Whispers of My Mind, and the piece you shared on creative transition too is there.
Thank you. Oh, it's been a pleasure, Terry. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Valerie.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for listening today, and I hope you found it inspiring and supportive. You can find the episode show notes, get your free copy of Chapter 1 of Wholehearted, and find out more about my books, coaching, and other offerings at quietwriting.com. Connect with me on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, where I am at Writing Quietly. Please leave a review on your favourite podcast app too to help others find the show and create their story. And warmest wishes for you as you create your story in the world.